Welcome to a new episode of Full Stack Cast. In this podcast, we're going to take a closer look at the humans behind Full Stack Fest, our ever-growing roster of amazing speakers. Their talks inspire us by widening our perspective and deepening our knowledge. But behind each one's technical expertise, there is an often lesser-known, well-rounded human with a wide range of interests and a unique life path. Full Stack Fest is an inspiring conference about software. It's happening on the first week of September in Barcelona, and it's organized by Codegram, who also produce this podcast. I'm your host, Chus, and today's guest is Sarah Drasner. Sarah is an award-winning speaker, head of developer experience at Netlify, and Vue core team member. She's also giving a workshop about design for developers the day before the conference. You can check it out at fullstackfest.com. I'm really thrilled to have you on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're one of the most expected guests. You're quite popular on the internet and stuff. Everyone's talking about you, your workshops, everything you do, basically, which is a lot of stuff. And I'm especially interested in how do you become Sarah Drasner?
Yeah, sure. I don't think that people should think it's so high to be me, because I'm just a regular lady. But I came from probably like not the normal way of coming into programming. I started a long time ago. I started 15 years ago, something like that. So like, college age. I was doing work for the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, and I was a scientific illustrator, so that meant that I drew snakes and lizards for encyclopedias. And they invented a camera that took the place of my job drawing these things. And so they asked me if I made websites. And at the time, websites weren't super complicated. They were like they were still HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but they were just kind of like mostly HTML and some inline JavaScript, and we had image maps. It was crazy.
Oh yeah, image maps.
Lots of tables.
I don't remember that.
Yeah. And the webmaster at the Field Museum, we had webmasters back then, took pity on me and kind of taught me how to make industry quality things. I was actually a college professor after that. I went to grad school and became a college professor, but I was still doing website work while I was doing the grad school and the teaching, because I didn't make a lot of money. So I made sites for Stanford and for UCSF and a few other kind of like scientific or medical related things. And yeah, when I came back to the US, I worked for an agency for a few years, and that was pretty intense. It was like you had to, clock your time like a lawyer and sign out to use the bathroom. And like, we weren't allowed to talk to each other. And if you coded a newsletter in like different amounts of time for different, newsletters, they would be like, this one was 2 minutes over the last time, what happened? Or like,
what?
If you're, it's pretty intense.
Minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like, they were really intense. So I did a lot of like, since it was an agency, I had to do a ton of different stuff, because you just don't know what your client is, you kind of have to adjust per client. So I would do like WordPress theme development, or like fix up people's like messy style sheets, or I would just basically like any kind of thing that they needed, like writing plugins. They would just throw me at stuff. And my boss used to make this joke, like, if it needs to take a long time, give it to Sarah. Because I tended to be, I don't know, I have like this weird thing where if something takes a really long time, I get really hyper focused. So they used to give me some like really weird, arduous tasks when I was there, which was also really good for kind of leveling up. And I, stayed there long enough to become a lead. And then I was a lead at a few different other places, most of which I was like working for a bunch of distributed systems, databases and stuff, making their sites or their operational dashboards and hooking all that stuff up. And then I was at Trulia or Zillow. Zillow and Trulia are the same company. And I managed a lot of like front end components for them, and kind of like if the kind of thing where like if you change one thing, it like affects 4,000 other things. And also just did like a bunch of other random work here and there as they needed me to as well. But that was mainly my job. And then I was a consultant, so I did a lot of different things for that too. Some people hired me for SVG animations. Some people hired me for building out animations and design systems. Some people hired me to just do regular dev, and some people hired me to, do that kind of component work. Like that's when I started using Vue, because one of my clients used Vue and I had to learn it, and I actually really liked it. So I just worked on a myriad of projects. Like I worked with Salesforce, I gave workshops to Netflix, and then just like a bunch of companies that are smaller too. I did work for Smashing, Microsoft, and then eventually Microsoft hired me, and I worked for Microsoft for Azure for a couple of years. And now I just started like a month ago working at Netlify, and I absolutely love it. I think it's probably the best fit of any job that I've had so far. And I just love their product so much. It's just like, it was one of my favorite things even before I joined. That's why I reached out to them.
Wow.
So,
I mean,
yeah. And now I get to lead a team there.
And when you were self-employed, you were also giving workshops.
Uh-huh.
Was it like companies asking you to give workshops? Was something that you kind of were pushing to kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I did a range actually, probably like at least 50%, maybe more of my income was from workshops. So I would go speak at conferences and then also do workshops while I was at the conference. And one of the years that I was consulting, I did 54 conferences. That was a lot.
Jesus.
So I did workshops for almost each one of those. So they're really tiring, but very, very fulfilling, because they're just so hands-on, where like when you give a speech, it's kind of a little bit more like a taste of things, because you can't cover things in such depth. And then when you do a workshop, you really get to see like the students, the light bulbs go on in students' heads, and that you can like help work out problems with people. And I just love that so much. I did do workshops for particular companies too. So it kind of went between like doing things for conferences, and then companies would hire me for the day or a week or something like that. Or then I would come on their staff and just train them for a little while. So that also happened, which were like kind of longer term engagements. So I basically like act as lead, where I set up the project and also trained people. So it kind of was a range. And then there were web animation workshops I did with Val Head, where we would find a venue, and then the two of us would go there and give a workshop that we basically made. So not attached to a conference.
From back then, the web has changed quite a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Do you recognize the web that you started doing?
Oh, well, I think the thing that's been really healthy for me is because I think when I was younger, I'd be more absolutist. Like I'd be like, this is the one true way. And like, I've seen enough of those things go in cycles, or I've changed my mind enough times, or like the whole web atmosphere has changed its mind so many times that I don't do that anymore. I tend to be a little bit more like pragmatic and like, okay, well, this works for right now, and I'm very excited about it now. There's probably trade-offs here, and something will eventually come along that's a little bit different. I tend to be a little bit more on the side of it depends, and then like an explanation. I mean, it's not fun when people say it depends and then just leave you with that.
It's kind of like kills the conversation, basically.
Yeah. So like, I like the it depends, with more explanation and reasoning behind this way versus that way, and the caveats, and like more of a discussion behind it. But yeah, I think having been around for a little bit here has been really helpful in kind of grounding me against dogmatism,
Yeah.
And thinking that there's just one way of doing things.
I think that's very needed in our community in general, because not only younger developers are like less experienced, like myself. When I was a bit less experienced, I was a lot more opinionated, let's say. Now I'm still a little bit, but I'm kind of recovering. You know, when you consume a lot of hacker news and Reddit and stuff, you tend to side with specific technologies and feel part of a tribe and all this stuff. And this kind of React people, and they defend React is the best thing ever in the world, and other people say JavaScript is the worst thing ever in the world. And
yeah, I think that that's true. I really think that it's hard not to, in a way, because you get excited about something, right? That like the positive side of that is that like you see a way that's really good, or even like you get bit by another way of doing things and you're like, oof, never again. And so I think it's challenging to not start to feel like, look, this is the way that of the future. And there are things that are kind of like obviously better to do. Like there are some things that where the trade-offs are so obviously in one way or another. So it's tempting to do that with everything, especially because I think as a developer, you have to make a lot of decisions in a day. And there's a thing called decision fatigue, where you get kind of tired of making decisions. And so if you can think in those ways, it's really, it's really elusive, because you're like, oh, like if I can just think of the one true way for everything, I won't have to make so many decisions in a day, and I can just build things really quickly. And that's why we end up with like pretty opinionated frameworks and stuff too, because sometimes that's better. Sometimes it actually helps us go faster. But the problem in that can always be that if you get too dogmatic about something where there just are trade-offs or there are multiple ways of working, you can shut people out, you can make people feel unwelcome, you can actually start to ignore some things that are positives that you can learn from. A lot of the frameworks are like actively learning from each other, and that's a good thing. That's like, having some, difference in framework land, and then also some things where people are going, hey, that's not such a bad idea. I mean, Vue is pretty much like, Evan like looked over a bunch of frameworks and was like, I like this part, and I like this part, and I like this part.
Yeah, with Vue, I had the same experience. Like I just saw it relatively recently, and I was like, wow, I actually do like it. But at the beginning, I was also kind of guilty of, I was kind of trained in ClojureScript with Omnext and this kind of philosophy. And then when people talked about anything else, I felt like, no, it can't be that good. And then I had a look at Vue and I'm like, oh, wow, this is really good. It actually reminded me that I'm also getting old and a little bit like, there's things to learn and I don't know everything. Basically, I don't know almost anything. So
it's not like a relation. We don't have to be monogamous with all of the tools.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I had the same kind of point of view. I was doing all this React dev, and then when I got hired for this project, I was like, ugh, I don't want to learn another framework. But then I started working with Vue, and I was like, oh, I really like this. It's like super legible, and I know where everything is immediately and stuff. And I think the thing that I always hear compared is the syntax, and that's such like a low kind of level of things. Like when you're really working with the frameworks, the syntax tends for me not to be the thing that you really start to pay attention to. It's things like reactivity or computed properties or using watchers, like stuff like that are like really change my experience as a developer, like working with something that's reactive versus not, or like understanding how caching works with computed properties is like a way bigger thing to me. And I don't feel like people really have that discussion because they just look at you can see the syntax super fast, right? And so that's something that you can like lock down on super quickly. But I think that's true. Like when I first heard about Svelte 2, I was kind of like, oh, not another one. I don't have the time for this. And like then when Svelte 2 came out and a lot of people were kind of talking about it or angry, I went and looked and I was like, this is cool, and it doesn't like hurt me working with Vue to think Svelte is cool. So I think that there's a little bit of a false dichotomy when we talk about these things. I think, React is wonderful, Vue is wonderful, Svelte is wonderful. There are reasons why I like there are particular things that I enjoy about one over the other, but that's an it depends kind of thing more than a you should all go do this kind of thing.
I think an important idea is that sometimes when you feel there's so many frameworks, the first idea you get is that they are opposites of each other and they have made decisions specifically to be like different. But actually, in reality, it's just very organic. Like someone made something, then someone made something else inspired on that. Then these ideas kind of feed back into the first framework. And it's kind of, a lot of times it's not just like choose your path. It's more like these paths are all like intertwined anyway.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's some stuff where there's like, when I think about, kind of like abstractions, there are some things that you feel comfortable with being abstracted away and some things that you don't want abstracted away. And that's probably going to change per developer. So there are some like personal preference keys in there, but like making sure that, when we communicate those things, that they're not super dogmatic. And then I guess even this part is like it depends. There are some things that it is helpful to be more dogmatic around. I think that's where like prettier comes in. Like I was so sick of having arguments about, semicolons or not semicolons or whatever. And then, prettier came along and I felt like it really refined code review because we weren't, bike shedding over stupid details anymore. We could kind of focus the conversation on the stuff that mattered.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like an interesting piece of it too.
Yeah. I used to be of the opinion that no, like code style is a personal signature and like you should have your own. And then I used to work with this guy who said, no, like, when you commit, everything should be formatted a certain way and then no one cares.
Yeah.
And all the team has the same format. I'm like, I don't know, because, this removes some kind of agency from the developer. But actually, the truth is it's a lot better because, the focus is stolen by these kind of bike shedding discussions. And this is really harmful.
I think I completely agree with you. There was I made this like teeny tiny JavaScript library a little while ago and I spent forever like hand formatting it and like making everything like amazing. And then like when I put it out, people were even commenting like, what nice code formatting. So when Prettier came out, I was like, but like I make it so nice. It was kind of like a personal point of pride for me. And then I started working with it in code bases where I was highly collaborative. And I just realized that like a couple things about clean code, I think people tend to think of clean code as like well formatted. And I've even fallen into that trap too. But clean code really should be this like ability to parse what it does. I'm sorry for using the word parse, but parse what it does cleanly, like understand it's not too convoluted. It does what it's intended to do and not, a bunch of side effect kind of other things. And so what the Prettier thing allowed us to do was to get the like concept of clean code being formatting out of the way, refocus our efforts on clean code actually being the quality of the code.
I think that's a much better use of our brain power.
Yeah, exactly. Especially because some of those things don't have right answers. Semis versus not semis, like I'm sure there's people who would argue with me that does have a right answer. But like you can go back and forth about that all day. And I have seen people do that. So
yeah.
It's a little like the...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Saying? It's a little like the Vim Emacs argument. Like, it's just not going to go anywhere.
Exactly. And I've seen a little bit of a pattern that I think is quite interesting, especially for newer developers, because they haven't lived it, which is when you were drawing illustrations of snakes and stuff, and then this new technology came along and it made it obsolete in a way, right? Like you quickly jumped onto the next thing, which was, they needed websites. So you do the websites and you learn what it takes to do it. And it happened as well with your pretty formatting, right? You were doing all this stuff and then this thing comes along, makes it obsolete in a way. And it's like, okay, move on. Like now your value, your the thing that you were proud of is useless, right? So now you have to move on to something else and like provide value somewhere else. And I think a lot of developers haven't lived this. They've started with the technology and they haven't seen it go obsolete yet. But this always happens, always. And I guess that's an argument against tribalizing around a specific technology. But would you give any advice to developers who basically they feel maybe stuck in a specific way or technology?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, honestly, I think I also started doing development at a time where developer jobs weren't so like high paid and like glamorous and like, you got to decide certain things about your job. Like it was like, you have to feed yourself and you do what you're told. Kind of like I don't, I would like to eat lunch, so I'm going to do this and do whatever they tell me. So in some ways that's definitely changed from like I think there's a certain pickiness that's allowed nowadays that I didn't really get to have. Not that I'm saying like, oh, poor me, but it's a paradigm shift, right? When you feel like you can decide things for yourself, that's a very different thing. One thing I will say is that the industry always changes. So being flexible is probably the best sign that you're going to survive in the long haul and, be able to do your best work, like remaining open and flexible. And also, if something makes you uncomfortable, this is something that I've had to learn. If some concept makes you uncomfortable, it is actually worth investigating, because there are some concepts that make you uncomfortable because they challenge you and they make you grow. There are other concepts that make you feel uncomfortable because you just don't like them, and that's fine too. But it's hard to tell the difference,
Yeah, it is.
When you're first hearing about it, you don't actually know why you feel uncomfortable. So I would say always, putting aside a bit of time to explore if you can. I know that some people have like families and they can't, they don't have a lot of spare time, but if you can set aside time to learn and explore and grow, you're actually in a better position to kind of stay in this industry, to grow in this industry, and to kind of survive all of the ebbs and flows that will come up. Because sometimes crazy things come out of nowhere and you don't expect them. And in order to stay current, you have to kind of like allow your ego to take a back seat to learning.
That is really, I think that's probably the best advice I've ever heard on developers and like development. It reminds me a little bit of sometimes when you're lacking in salt, your brain interprets that as it triggers like a sugar craving. Okay, but you're lacking in salt. And this reminds me a little bit of like when developers don't know something or feel like something is a little bit strange or they haven't heard of it, they confuse it with something being bad or unnecessary. Like their reasoning, I guess, is like, if I haven't heard of it or I don't know what it is, it's probably not needed or it's bad because I'm a developer and I earn my wages,
I think you're like bug in the brain. I mean, that's the salt sugar thing is a really good metaphor. That's really well stated because, yeah, there are some things that we tend to believe or think or convince ourselves. There's tons of different ways that we lie to ourselves. So like one of the biggest things that I've talked to people about in, some of the work that I've done, and when people like, kind of when we talk about, development, is that people think that there's a right brain, left brain, and they've done lots of studies to show that that's not true. That actually your brain doesn't do right brain, left brain. And actually the kind of the opposite is true, that the more you use your brain in myriad ways, the more synapses you create and fire across, and the more you're able to actually do a lot of different creative problem solving and makes you better at more things. So they're actually finding the opposite to be true. And so what I've noticed used to happen a lot, I haven't seen it as much lately, and I hope that people don't do it so much, is that people will say, oh, I'm such a bad designer, as a way of saying, oh, I'm a really good developer. But really, that doesn't mean you're a good developer. You're just a bad designer. Your brain isn't like a pendulum that swings up and down and goes further one way or the other. You can learn different tasks. And I think the reason why people say stuff like that is, well, sometimes it's to put down other people that might be good at crossing boundaries. But it's the other thing about it is that people try to convince themselves that they're not capable of more than one tasks, right? Like it simplifies everything if you're just like, I'm only good at this one thing and I never have to learn anything else. And that can be true. Certainly if you deep dive into something, that's really wonderful. You get to know that really well. But I think that if the more you challenge yourself to kind of push beyond the boundaries of what you know and think in a different kind of way, the more you'll find that there's just tons of different ways of thinking about a solution. And it kind of opens the world up to different possibilities, even within just really strict programming. So, I think, there's a limited amount of time in the world, but if you're going to spend time on this earth doing anything, feeding your mind is a good way to spend your time.
Yeah, I guess a question that a lot of people might have, like, even if they want to become better, I guess they think, should I become more of a generalist? Should I learn something outside of my comfort zone, or should I go deeper in my current kind of skill set?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I honestly think that sometimes what people do is they'll I get these emails sometimes from people who are comparing themselves to me now at like 1 month or 1 year or 6 months in the industry. And they're like, why haven't I learned as much as you? I'm like, whoa, yeah. I have been doing this for a while. Like, give yourself a break. I do think that there's possibility to do both, to deep dive in an area and then come back up and do some general work, or like deep dive in an area and explore something else. But I don't think it happens all at once. And I think if you're starting out, like, give yourself a moment. Don't compare yourself to people who have been doing it much longer than you. And also don't compare yourself to what people put out in the world. Cause I know I make a lot of like crappy stuff that doesn't ever see the light of day. And I just show people the stuff that makes sense to show people. So, I went to a CodePen meetup a little while ago, and people were kind of being really shy about sharing. And so I just went up and I opened up my private pens and showed people all this like garbage that I made. It was like horrible. Just like, what is it? Kill it with fire. And, it takes me a good amount of that stuff to make anything that's worth, making public. So I think, maybe I'm steering a little bit, but like, I think some point in the question is like, I think there's some things that I'm a generalist at and some things that I'm really specifically, skilled at, and those things, and you can do both, but it didn't happen overnight, right? It happened over a longer period of time.
Yeah. I guess that's hard to grasp when you're just starting. You want to be that, developer that you dream of being right away. And it really takes a lot of time. And sometimes it takes a lot of time through paths that are not obvious. Like, for example, I'm sure that your time at the agency, it taught you a lot of things that a lot of people wouldn't like to go through that, but you learn a lot from them, from that, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I look back at that time, it was really hard. I probably wouldn't take it back because I leveled up so much, but it's even hard to say that because it was just so rough. And I think that there's this temptation in kind of inspiring juniors to say like, oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. And like, it's not, coding can be easy and things like it makes me uncomfortable because I'm not sure that that's true.
Yeah.
Like it's not necessarily always easy. And I don't know if you're setting people up for success exactly to say things like that. But I know that sounds gatekeepy too. And I don't want to sound gatekeepy, but I do want to manage people's expectation that like, I'm not saying you should work every weekend or whatever and like, do stuff that like sometimes I've worked too hard and too much and, been burnt myself out or something like that. I'm not saying that you should follow that because that's not great. But I do think that you do kind of get what you give. And yes. So there's a bit of a balance there. Like it's also not setting people up for success to tell them that they don't have to try so hard, because you do kind of have to try hard in order to get, at least advanced in something, but not everybody wants to be advanced in something. That's totally cool too. I think if we're really on the level, if you want to level up in something, yeah, it's going to take a lot of focus and determination. And some of that's not going to be exactly like the most fun, but I think it's rewarding.
Yeah, I think now that you brought up gatekeeping, there's room for everything. You know what I mean? Like
Mm-hmm.
if it's
Mm-hmm.
a growing market, so if you want to just learn to make a basic website, there's plenty of websites to be made. So don't worry,
Mm-hmm.
there's jobs. Like you can definitely work, not really leveling up that much. But if you want to level up, it is kind of, the more you put in, the more you get, which is something that doesn't happen in a lot of industries. And in this one, it's pretty true that if you put more effort, if you learn more things, you'll eventually kind of surface. And also people will notice you as well because, not that many people put a lot of effort. So you will definitely surface, but you don't have to. I guess like reconciling these two views is hard because, the people who are really skilled, they tend to think, no, everyone should be really skilled because I'm really skilled. So
yeah, I agree with you. I think there's plenty of room for everybody. There's lots of sites to be made. There's all sorts of different kinds of sites to be made. There's also different kinds of jobs and levels of things. I've definitely been a dev who wanted to just code, and that was my day job. And then at night, I hung out with my friends or went home or whatever. And then I had other points in my life where I was like, no, I really want to, make lots of stuff for other people and be out in the community and, do open source in my spare time and still see my friends. But like, but, I worked a lot harder during some points than others. And those periods sometimes lasted years, some periods I just kind of coasted and some periods I worked really, really hard. So it's not just one right answer. And it's not even one right answer for each person. You can be different in different times in your life. I do think that like when I don't mean to make it sound like it's not fun. There's definitely stuff where I just have the best time programming. Like I wouldn't work on the weekends sometimes if I didn't find it fun, right? Like I wouldn't there are times like where it's rainy outside and I got my dogs and I watched a movie and I'm just coding and I'm just like having the best time. So it's definitely not to say like hard work isn't fun because it can totally be just wonderful. But yeah, it can be a commitment and you do have to kind of see it through sometimes. And that's a piece of that as well.
I think you touched upon an issue that a lot of people are living in their own skin, which is this balance between, coding and the rest of life, let's say, and avoiding burnout and like keeping motivation high, because I've experienced it myself. Sometimes I'm like really all in, I code a lot, then suddenly I feel like kind of burned out or like lack of motivation. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to try or like to experiment with. So how would you advise like a new developer about balance and burnout?
Yeah, no, that's a good subject matter. I think for me personally, and I can't speak for other people, I tend not to burn out because of too much work. That doesn't mean that other people won't. That's just how I'm built. I don't tend to burn out. Just like the woman I worked for who said, like, if you need something that takes a long time, give it to Sarah. Like, I don't mind working long hours. What I do get burned out on is when I'm not aligned with the reasons why. So if I'm working heads down on something, or I'm working very hard on something, or I'm, doing a ton of stuff, if people above me can't give me a good reason why I'm doing it, I burn out super hard because I'm just not aligned with goals, and I feel like the work is pointless, and it makes me kind of it makes me really frustrated because I feel like the very base level, it should at least be about communication. I don't know exactly why that is, but if I think that something is going to be a really great product for people, or it's going to be super useful and helpful, then I have a very easy time working hard on it. But if I feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or we have no idea why we're doing this, we're just doing it because someone said so, I just start to really lose focus, lose attention. I start to feel really depressed. That tends to be when I burn out.
That resonates really, really highly with me, I think, because I have the same attitude. And And sometimes also maybe it's a skill to be able to kind of power through something that you don't believe in. I don't know if it's a skill or not, but sometimes you have to do it. But yeah, it's true that, for me, it's extremely depressing. Like, I would say it's probably dangerous to my health to go too long, like this.
There is a level of working too much that probably gets me burnt out. But that's the one that really drives me down.
Something I'm really curious about, because you're giving workshops and like working with companies when you were a consultant, you've probably found very different attitudes to your advice and to your workshops. Like, there's people who are really eager to try something new, to learn something from you, but there's probably people who you find they have a strong resistance to change. Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with that? Because that's another skill of its own.
Oh, totally. I feel like communication in general is like a whole different skill from programming. It's like you fix the code, and now you've gone into like PR land where you have to learn how to communicate with humans about your code. I think it depends on the company culture, of course. There are certain companies where people are super receptive to change. I mean, working at Netlify, like, oh my God, everyone is so positive and like easygoing, and nobody's super like this is mine, don't touch it, which happens sometimes at companies. So like, I've really come to appreciate that some of the reason why the product is so good is because the people are so collaborative and listen to each other and gain knowledge from each other without a lot of ego. And I've seen the opposite of that at other companies where people really get in their own way by like creating a culture of like, this is mine, that's yours, don't touch it, don't talk to me. Or like people really resistant to change, people unwilling to listen to each other's opinions. Sometimes I got called in as a consultant, totally like just to like settle arguments between teams who had a hard time communicating. And so I think those kind of things can be super challenging. And that's even like, this can even change within a company. If you get a company big enough, some groups are really collaborative and some groups aren't. If you have a company that's gigantic, it's not even necessarily something you can say about the whole company. You get like little pockets of mini companies inside of the company. So I think that culture can completely shift based on where you are. And so, it's something that you have to read a little bit about the way that things go or the way that people talk to each other. Some places, sometimes it's not necessarily a good or bad. It's just different, right? Like there are some companies where people are more straightforward and some companies where people use more qualifiers. So one example would be like, I think we needed this change versus I really like the way that we had it before, but I think we needed this change because this is happening and maybe we can change it in the future. Like neither of those are wrong and they convey the same thing, but depending on the company culture, you can have two ways of talking. And so as a consultant, I just found that I had to adjust the way that I was speaking a little bit based on the way that they talked.
Yeah, that's so true. That's similar to my experience as well. But even in a more granular way, sometimes I found that you need to identify, because when you come into a team, basically it's like you come into a family or a home. Like there's the whole like dynamics that you don't know about. You need to figure out who is who, like who cares about what, and how do you have to talk to a specific person to kind of satisfy what they want, right? So maybe someone cares about maintainability. Maybe someone cares about, something being bug free or something like that, right? And you have to kind of sell it in a different way.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. And that's different from when you're at a company and you can kind of, you start to like have your like work wife and like, you start to have like the people that are your like usual suspects of, people that you can kind of talk to and trust and depend on and stuff. Whereas in a consultant relationship, you don't necessarily have that depending on the length of the engagement. Like eventually, sometimes you do, but like if it's a shorter engagement, you just kind of have to, have your ears out for how people work and pay attention to the things that, like you said, that they value. Some people value moving quickly. Some people value going slower and being more purposeful. Some people value not moving things too much. Some people are like, rewrite this, and some of that also depends on people's budgets too. Like if they call me in and they have unlimited budget, obviously like I have a little bit of a longer leash. And then some people are like, look, we have $4,000. What can you do in this amount of time?
Yeah.
So there can be different kind of things for that too.
Yeah, I think how does that contrast with your experience at working at such a big corporation like Microsoft?
Well, I was consulting with Salesforce right before it, so it wasn't too hard of a transition because those are both really gigantic companies, and it's not that their cultures were the same, but the concepts were similar. Where there's team, like I'd work on this team and then I'd work on that team and they're talking to each other. Microsoft was very much like that, where, like I mentioned before, like companies within companies. So it wasn't too much of a culture shock. Plus, Zillow and Trulia isn't the size of Salesforce or Microsoft, where it's just gigantic, but that's not a small company either. So past a certain point, it's the same kind of thing where you've got a liaison between groups and get people's feedback and, get kind of sign off. I think there's like more sign off that happens in those bigger environments than in a smaller environment. If you want to make changes, you have to get buy-in from more people. And there's kind of more of a concept of selling your idea before you implement it at bigger companies, where smaller companies, you still do that a little bit, but it can be a little bit more collaborative because you can gather everybody in a room and be like, what do you think? And they can be like, I like it, but I don't like this part. And you kind of iterate. Whereas in big companies, if you're going to make a major change, or if you're going to, do a larger project that takes time, you do need to like go up and get buy-in. And like sometimes the idea changes in the time that you comes back down to you and you're like, wait, this wasn't the thing. So that can be kind of like a thing, or the timelines can be much longer because they have the money to do that. So that like kind of like an interesting thing that happens is that they're like, let's do this in like a few months or something. Whereas like a tinier company's like, we can't have it in 2 weeks. Like, wait, what? Like, I consulted with like a company that was like 7 people. And like, if you couldn't do it quickly, like what's going on there? Because they didn't have a lot of money to kind of burn on sitting around and thinking about things.
Yeah.
So I think it also, it can affect the speed of things as well. So yeah, I think that those things can totally change based on the company.
Yeah. I wonder also how was your experience managing people as well? Because a lot of developers, they maybe aspire to be team leads, or they totally don't want to manage anyone. And do you think there's, any kind of good synergy between managing people and coding?
Yeah, totally. When I was, there are some jobs where I was kind of more of a lead, or like hybrid, where I was managing people and also still coding. So a lot of the jobs that I had were like that. Truly and Zillow was like that. And the kind of distributed systems jobs I had before that were like that. When I was at Microsoft towards the end, I was doing I was doing IC work for a majority of the time and was promoted towards the end. And then I was doing a little less of the IC work and kind of doing more managerial tasks. And then at Netlify, I'm doing kind of more of the like leading, but also doing some work of my own. But I think managing engineers is always really interesting, and I think it's the kind of what's kind of interesting about it is that you have all of these articles all around about like how to do this technical concept, but we don't have a lot of articles about engineering management. And I think that there could definitely stand to be more of them, and people could stand to share, because people basically what happens is they're like, you're such a good engineer, now become a baker. Like it's like a totally different skill set. That makes it a little bit challenging, but I also see why there aren't articles like that, because you don't want to be divulging things about people in those articles. Like, it's harder to share learnings about a human than it is about a code base. One thing that I try to do with my employees is to be fairly transparent about the reasons why I'm making a change, or, adjusting things, or we're working on something. Just because, knowing myself, if I'm not, like I said before, if I'm not aligned with the why, I don't appreciate that. Like, I can do better work if I understand what the trade-offs are and what the context is. Another thing is, when I was working at Zillow, this is like kind of funny. I used to like nerd swipe people to get work done sometimes. If people on the podcast don't know what nerd swiping is, it's like when you're just kind of like, the Webpack build should be doing this, but it's doing this other thing. Isn't that weird? And they'd be like, no, I don't have time for this. I gotta do this other ticket. And I'm like, wait. And then they're like, wait, why is it doing that? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know, but it's okay. You don't have to work on that right now. And then they'd be like, damn it.
Oh, yeah.
They go checking them. So that might be a kind of evil way of managing, but it also does the thing of making people interested on their own rather than me authoritatively telling them to do stuff. I usually get more interested when someone treats it more like a puzzle than if somebody's like, I'm your manager and I told you so. So I tend to lean into that kind of thing, or just being transparent about why it's valuable.
This is such a great trick. I think the magic words you said is, you don't have to work on this right now, because that really triggers me into puzzle mode. It's like, oh, no, I want to do it, because it's not what I'm supposed to be doing. So.
Yeah, up to you. You don't have to. And truthfully, I would have done it, I can cover stuff too. So if no one wants to do it, sometimes I'll do it. But yeah, there are probably other better ways of doing things, but I tended to do things that way because I do tend to kind of think about what I would want as an engineer when I manage. And that's how I work. So
I think it tends to be, it's a shame is what you said about, when an engineer is really good, then they promote them to baker, manager. And there's all these self-taught bakers in town. You know what I mean? Every engineering manager is self-taught completely. Yes. So it's it's a shame. It's basically hit or miss, if you figure it out, great. If not, you're a terrible manager. Yeah.
And I was talking to my friend Sarah Drasner recently, and she's like, I never want to go into management because I don't want to mess up a person. And I think that's a really good reason to not want to go into management. It can be challenging because humans, unlike code, are non-deterministic. If you have a function, you have a well-written function, you're getting the same results every time you run it. With humans, it doesn't necessarily work that way. Some days they're really tired. Some days they're really excited. Some days they feel super motivated. Some days they're dealing with personal issues, and you don't necessarily even know. But I think as a manager, the only thing that I've really figured out is being communicative and also letting them know what my failures or preferences or whatever are, so that they at least have some tools to work with me. One thing I tell my employees is that I really value one-on-ones, and I think that it's very important for them to have time. That time is for us to talk about their career and growing them, and not all the other time is about the company, right? But that time is their time. And one thing that I've noticed about myself is that if somebody brings a problem to me in a one-on-one, I immediately try to fix it. And humans don't always want you to fix things. Sometimes they just want to vent. So one thing I'll tell them is if you come to me and you have a problem and you want to vent, just let me know that this is venting time, because then I'll listen. But if you don't tell me that, I'm just going to try to fix your issue.
That's a really good advice.
So yeah, and maybe just like knowing your limitations a little bit, which might only come from doing it wrong.
And how do you deal with kind of conflict in a team? Like, for example, when someone is against a technical decision you established, or maybe they're kind of hesitant. Maybe they don't think it's the right thing to do, or
yeah. I mean, I think so if it happens in a PR, I tend to like the conversation goes only so long before I'll be like, okay, this method of communication isn't immediate enough, or you can't, like, you get some mirror neuron things that happen when you look at someone's face that are a little bit devoid of empathy if you're just typing into a screen. So if it's like in a code review or PR and people are getting really heated, it will only go on so long before I'll pull them both off and say, like, okay, let's all meet in person and talk about this, and then we can kind of suss things out a little bit better. Usually that yields pretty good results. If it's a conflict that's bigger than that, that's like about a design decision, then yeah, we've got to, same kind of thing where we have to kind of sit down and hash things out. Pros and cons lists are good. Weighing different, like coming to the table with like, all right, all things being equal, there are probably different ways of doing this. So like, let's figure out which one works for us right now. One challenge that I've noticed that happens a lot is that there'll be two things, and one of them is a really good idea maybe, but due to some of the constraints around, it's not a good idea. Mm-hmm. And so, it's this kind of like evergreen project, perfect world scenario. Someone coded something over the weekend and it was so cool and fun, but like for a large company where everyone would have to have buy-in, and you're basically telling everybody that you're going to dump a new framework into an old existing code base because you liked it. Like, okay, like let's pause and really evaluate the constraints. Because sometimes people can only see like the shiny, and there are always more shinies out there. So that I think that's been maybe one of the bigger conversations that I've had to kind of deal with conflict through, is kind of sitting down and saying, like, you might be right, this might be a really good way of working, but here are the constraints that we're working within, and like painting the picture of the entire code base, all the people we're sharing it with, all of the like, what happens if this goes wrong kind of things. And if the idea emerges and is still great, then great. But if not, then they can kind of see that it's not that their idea was a bad one. It's just that there's a lot of other things that we're juggling to kind of make those decisions, and not just like shutting it down. Like, really, people want to, like, they want to feel heard. like hearing them out. Yeah. Hearing them out is really important. And sometimes they're right, so approaching the table and really listening to the things that they have to say. But yeah, sometimes there's a lot of constraints that suck and you just can't do everything,
Yeah. And I think this is aggravated by the issue that in general, people feel attached to their ideas and what they do. So it's like, it's really easy to hurt them if you somehow put aside their idea, or, you have to really make it clear that it's not about them, or that, they're not being hurt, but it's just like, at this moment, we need to do something else.
Totally.
This reminds me at a client once, I was really excited working, when you get really excited working on something so much that you kind of go the extra mile and do something super cool that no one asked for. But you think that is really cool. So it was like a kind of a basic search. Basically, it was like full text search, right? Over like a series of data. And then I just implemented a little kind of Boolean algebra so that you can have like constraints and this term, or these other terms and stuff. So it was really cool. And you could search within the fields, and there was like completion. It was really cool, right? Like, I was so proud. It took me like a couple of days, like all kind of head down, just doing that. And then after that, I remember I had a manager who saw it, and I showed it off like super proud, like, look, our users are going to love this. They can do all these kind of custom search. And he said, yeah, they're not going to understand it. I'm like,
No.
they will, like in this case.
You can see the part where his heart breaks.
Yeah. Like I was like still like kind of clinging onto it. I'm like, no, they're like traders. They're people used that manipulating data and stuff. They will definitely get it. And he said, no, I'm sorry, but I don't think so. I'm like, can we try it? Just give it to users. If they don't like it, we can revert it. And he said, no, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Like, no. At that moment, I was like,
God.
All right. And like a few years back, that would have not ended well. Like I would have gone home like really upset and really kind of wrong with a feeling of like being wronged.
Uh-huh.
But actually, I think it was a sign that something changed in me. And what I did is just delete the code.
Uh-huh.
And that's it. And that was like kind of almost like therapeutic. Like it was like, wow, I just deleted 2 days of work and it's okay. Like I'm not my code. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I mean, divorcing yourself from that is really emotionally intelligent. I do wish that your manager had like talked it through with you a little bit more than that, or maybe done user testing or something. But user testing is kind of nice because then at least you get some data behind the decisions. But
yeah, right. Yeah. I would have liked to see like hard data backing either opinion. But sometimes, actually, he didn't do it with this purpose. But I think having to divorce yourself from your code for no reason, sometimes it can be like it can teach you something.
Oh, totally. I mean, and people should understand that they're not their code, right? Like, people like it. I think that's a really hard thing to detach yourself from. I have a hard time with that, like that I'm not my work kind of thing, because you put so much of yourself into it. It's very challenging not to feel like that.
Yes,
it's not the easiest thing in the entire world. You could even like tell yourself that when you're just sitting here and go like, I am not my code, and be like, yeah, I understand that, and then like 2 days later be like, what the heck? They like filed an issue that was so rude, like
Yeah. I think once I went to a code kata in like a meetup. I think it was a closure meetup or something like that. And the idea was horrifying at the beginning, was just work on a problem for like 15 minutes and then delete all your code.
Whoa.
And I was like, what? No, I can't do that. And then do it all over again with a different design. Oh no, I cannot delete my work. Like that's like kind of cutting off a limb or something,
Yeah, I mean, like Chris Coyer was making fun of me a little while back because I use the fork button on CodePen a lot. Like when I'm not, doing quite as much work on CodePen as I used to, but I used to do a lot of work on CodePen, and I would like work on something for a little while and then fork it and then work on something just in case something got it was like my way of making like, poor man's version control, because of that concept of like, I cannot lose work. I cannot lose any of my work. But yeah, I mean, there was one time that I like lost, something that I had been working on for a while. And this wasn't in CodePen. This was just, I didn't commit it. Like I'd been working on it for a while. And then I forget what happened. My computer died or something like that. And I was really upset, and then I re-implemented it, and it was actually better than the first time I wrote it. So sometimes exercises like that can be really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably a little bit cheesy, but like sometimes I feel like when you write code, there's a byproduct of the code. Like the code is the byproduct, and the real thing is happening inside you. So you delete the code, and it's still within you, what you learned about the problem or about the design. So
yeah, totally.
Yeah, it's fine. It's just a byproduct. You delete it, and you can do it again and better.
Yeah, exactly. Well, cool. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. This was a really nice conversation.
Yeah, I think it has a lot of actionable advice that usually you don't see in like a lot of blog posts.
Yeah, I guess I should put the caveat in there, like you don't have to do things like I did and had mistakes all through my life. So go your own way too.
Yeah, that's important to note as well. Like everyone has to build their own path. Cool. So thank you so much for making it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you again in September. at the conference.
Yeah, I'm excited for Full Stack Fest. That's going to be so great.
Yeah, I'll see you in September.
Yeah, have a good one. Thank you so much. Bye.
And to our listeners, I hope you've all enjoyed this episode. If you want to see Sarah on stage or sign up for her workshop about designing for developers, you can go to fullstackfest.com. Until next time, and see you all in September.